let me first start off by saying this, ladies. God is not sending women to hell by the way they dress, nor is God allowing women to enter into heaven by what they don't wear. Jesus didn't die and shed his blood because of a dress. That's not the gospel. This is man's religion we're seeing here. You know, Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy, and we know the verse, 1 Timothy 2, verse 9. It says that women should what? Should adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing. Now, let's back up a minute, because we have a text here. We have a script that's written 2,000 years ago in the Far East. They called it the Ancient East. It's a different culture. It's a different time. It's a different era that Paul is living in, and he's dealing with a certain group or class of women in the church of Ephesus. Mind you, Timothy, again, he's the pastor, he's the bishop of the church of Ephesus. They did not have a Bible back then. They only had Paul's letters that were circulating through the Asia Minor, those 7 churches in the book of Revelation. So they did not have a Bible. So Paul said to Timothy, give attention to reading. Meaning, read this letter before the people, the women, the men, the congregation at the church of Ephesus. So he addresses a group of people here. Now, let's keep in mind, women of that time did dress moderately. If you do the study in the background, the culture, they were already dressing moderately. They did not have the clothes. The women didn't have the clothes that we have today. They had long, flowing, gown-like dresses, and they were called stolas. The men wore togas. And over the top of the stolas, the women would put a tunic on. And then they would have a hairpiece, a shroud sort of type of hairpiece that would cover their heads. So they were already dressing moderately, the Jewish women that were, because of course they had the law of Moses, and the law of Moses taught them how to dress. It also told the men how to dress. It says a man shall not wear anything that pertains to a woman. Well, if we were to take that text right then and there and go to England and Ireland and speak to these Irishmen, because they wear what we call skirts. So how do we bridge the gap of a script that was written thousands of years ago and then apply it to today? This is what takes skill. This is what it takes study. This is where it takes the interpretation skills and the method of interpretation of rightly dividing the word of truth. Because if we don't, you're going to have error. You're going to have confusion. You're going to have anger. You're going to have controversy like we're having today in the church. Because what is Paul talking about here? Because the women were already dressing in modest apparel. So who are these women? That's the question. Who are these women that Apostle Paul is talking to at the church of Ephesus? Now, from a background perspective, Ephesus was a rich, wealthy city. It was a commerce. It was an epic center. They had export. They had import. They had fabrics that they were making and artwork and perfumes and textile industry. It was a wealthy city. And these women who had just come to Christ were Gentile women. They didn't have the law. They had their own way of dressing. And they had become rich women. They were well-to-do. They were classy. They were elegant. And they could afford these costly clothing. Because, watch this, what is expensive to me is not expensive to you. What is costly to you might not be costly to me. So you had different statuses of different women ranking in the church like we do today. You have some educated, some non-educated, some young women, some older women. So he's addressing a group of people at that time, Apostle Paul's time, and he's giving a letter to Timothy saying, wait a minute, we've got to put this in order because the women in this church who were coming to dress in the church, they were also noisy, they were loud, they were talkative, they were clamorous. This is why Paul spoke and said, I do not permit a woman to speak in the church. Is he talking about all women? No, he's not. He's talking about the women at the church of Ephesus, because these women were turning church into a fashion show. They were coming to church decked out. They were coming to church like they were on their way to heaven, and Paul had to set in order that this is what it's all about. It's not about decorating the outward appearance. It was about decorating the heart. They had lost focus on the outward external appearance, and they weren't putting quality time in decorating and adorning the heart with virtues like shamefacedness, virtues like kindness and love and faith and hope. They had lost, as the book says in Revelations, their first love. This was the issue that Christ had. He said, nevertheless, I have this against you, that you have left your first love. In other words, church services had become literally a pageant, and women were actually competing with one another of themselves with other women as who looks the best. Paul wasn't saying that these women couldn't wear gold and pearls. They were spending their money on these things to decorate the outward appearance and to be pleasing to their husbands, and they were distracting some of the other worshipers there because the focus was on themselves. It wasn't that Paul was saying you couldn't wear gold, you couldn't have pearl earrings, you couldn't have gold necklaces, and preachers have preached this. I've heard them saying, if you wear gold or pearl, you're going to hell. That's not what the text says. It was about public worship. It was about coming to the house of God dressed in modest apparel, because the women, the Jewish women who worked at home, they worked around the house, they worked in the field, they were coming to the house of God in the same clothes that they had worked in all day. This was the message that this was the idea that Paul was trying to convey to the women. He was telling them, before you come to the house of God, if you've been at work all day, you can imagine the perspiration, you can imagine the dirt that could have been on their clothes. He was telling them, take a shower, bathe, put on modest apparel and come to the house of God, because you're coming into the presence of a king. You would not come into the presence of a king any kind of way. Back in the days of Apostle Paul, the king had the authority to execute you. So Paul was trying to convey the idea that be respectable when you come into the house of God. Mind you, Paul never told these women how to dress outside the church. This was only when you are attending the place of public worship. Why? Why is the Bible silent on how women should dress outside of church? Well, there's two reasons. One, we can pretty much assume that if women dressed moderately in the church, they would dress moderately outside the church. But the truth is, nobody dresses moderately 365 days a year. The other aspect is Paul knew his authority that he had. Paul knew that he couldn't cross the bounds and tell a woman how she should dress, a married woman, how she should dress outside the church. So he's quiet about that. He's silent about that. He only addresses the dress code on how women should dress when they are in the public place of worship, and how they are to conduct themselves in the house of God, that they would be of a meek and a humble spirit, a quiet spirit, in which he talks about a precious spirit in decorating the heart with these virtues. They had missed out because they left their first love. It's not about gold. It's not about earrings. It's about the